Okay, so today is August 10th, 2020. My name is Chelsea Lee. I am here with Dr. Donna Murphy, and we will be conducting a full-length interview. So let's get started. So where and when were you born?
I was born in Houston in 1979
Who did you live with throughout your childhood?
with my parents and my sister and my brother eventually. They're younger than me.
So yeah, you mentioned you had two siblings. How did this kind of shape your experience living with a younger sister and brother?
It's a good question. I feel like it motivated me to uh, share my experiences with them, I guess, and kind of broadly speaking, my experiences. So just through school, what I learned going through school, my experience with parents, um, being in an immigrant household. Um, yeah, I guess maybe that was uh, the biggest the biggest way in which I was influenced by being an older sibling.
Can you describe a bit about like the neighborhood and community that you grew up in?
Yeah, sure. So we moved a couple of times. We started off in Northwest Houston in the Cyfair area, and I'd say that there that area was not as diverse as the area that we moved to when I was in junior high, um, but it was much more diverse than the area that I ultimately ended up in for high school, which was in Spring Branch. But yeah, we moved within the Cyfair Independent School District, which was, I think, at the time and even for some time thereafter, one of the most rapidly growing public school districts in the country. And it was becoming more and more diverse. And so while in elementary school, I was in an area where there were not, from my recollection, a large number of like um, non-white students. In middle school or junior high, there were, my perception was that they were actually majority, quote unquote, minority students.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, and then high school, I moved to Spring Branch, and the demographics there were much different than in junior high, where there I think was the greatest diversity during my early like childhood years. High school was again predominantly white, and then there it was also pretty privileged, like pretty wealthy students and families.
Yeah, could you go on a bit about maybe your parents' occupations and maybe any expectations they had for you as you were growing up?
Sure. My father was or is still an accountant, and he has his own accounting business. And my mother basically did, you know, everything that he did, but does not have those certifications. And so she worked with him to run his business. I'm sorry, the second part of that question was what?
Oh, sorry. Did they have any expectations for you growing up?
I think for me, it was primarily expectations that I set for myself. They did, I recall, suggest very early. I think when I first suggested that I wanted to be a doctor when I was like 5, right? They they certainly did like pretty uncritically support that. And I was very self-critical about it. I mean, obviously, it was something that I just kind of blurted out as a 5-year-old. It's not something I'm necessarily going to stick with through my older childhood years or adolescent years or young adult years necessarily. Um, but my parents became kind of attached to the idea. So I guess it did become their expectation, but it was something that I originally had thrown out there. That was, I think, very similar to other things that I did in my life, either as a function of my personality or maybe my birth order. I was, very motivated. I took a lot of initiative. And so I kind of created the expectations for my siblings, I think, as a function of who I was and how I was. But they did not necessarily have like an idea in their heads, I think, prior to me of what their child should be like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I see. So since you created this kind of expectation from your parents for your siblings, did they follow in similar footsteps to you?
Could you say that again, Chelsea? I didn't
Oh,
catch that.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Oh, um, oh, I think you're muted. I think your audio is muted. Yeah, there you go. Sorry. Can you hear me now though?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I can hear you as well. Oh, I think you just muted again.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, yes. This is,
Okay, I'm sorry. I
no,
just had
you're all good.
rooms. Sorry, what was your question after you asked me about parental expectations?
Oh, right. Since you said you kind of influenced your parents' expectations of your siblings, did they follow in similar footsteps to you?
Um, my sister did, but on a very different time scale, and my brother did not at all. And I think that, you know, because my sister did, but not until some time had passed, they, I think both of them felt a bit challenged by my parents' expectations of them as a function of who I had been, and I don't know, the bar that I had set, right? And
Right,
I don't want to say it's a bar in terms of like it's higher or lower than something, but it is something, right? It is
right,
some
right,
kind of standard, right?
for
Uh,
sure.
yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. What would you say that your experiences were like in the education system, kind of growing up before college?
Sorry. I would say that, oh gosh, it's such a broad question.
I know.
um, I mean, I don't, what part of that question do you want me to tackle? Like whether I had challenges, whether, I mean, what particular kinds of
Mhm.
challenges, what kind of, what
Right,
aspect of that question?
right. Like any challenges that you faced. Yeah, that would be great.
Um, hmm. I mean, there are so many different kinds of things I can talk about here. Um, I mean, there are some things that I've always considered kind of trivial. I mean, in retrospect, I think that I ought to probably not erase those experiences in the way that I did growing up. Um, I mean, I guess I could talk about that. I mean, I have a number of like accounts that I recall of being discriminated against as a kid, um, which I just honestly felt was a part of life. I just felt like, oh well, that's just how things go, and um, I didn't let it really bother me very much at the time. I didn't really reflect very heavily on it growing up, but I think more and more as I've like understood like racial injustice and anti-immigrant attitudes in the United States, I've looked back with a more critical lens on that, and also in thinking about how I raise my own children in the face of that kind of discrimination, what people call often microaggressions. And I think
Mhm.
that honestly, it does a disservice to those people who have those experiences because it is a kind of erasure. It's to say that they're not really that significant. Those are microaggressions, right?
Right.
And I think that it's unfair because those experiences can be traumatizing. And certainly some communities, I think, face that in a much deeper way, and a historic and intergenerational way than I had. I mean, my parents newly immigrated here in the 1970s, and And just even the history of immigration of Korean Americans to this country is relatively newer. And then there are like historic injustices against like indigenous communities here, and people who had been enslaved here, and they're the descendants of people who were brought here enslaved. And that's a very, very different, I think, in many ways. But in the way that I think we all tend to get erased, that our experiences tend to get ignored or minimized, that is, I think, a similar experience. So yeah, I mean, I guess that those are some of the challenges that I face, which, like I said, again, at the time, I didn't really think of them as challenges. I didn't actually think of them as very distinct from, like, if somebody called me, like, they said something that was demeaning about my physical appearance or something like that, that has nothing to do with my race, right? Like, oh, one arm is fatter than the other or something, right? Like, whatever kind of comment somebody might make, I, at the time, never considered that would be any different. Like, at the end of the day, they're saying something that is offensive to me. I don't know why I would receive that any differently if it had to do with my race versus, my immigration status versus my physical appearance. Like, it's all mean, like,
Yeah.
and I've thought a lot more about that as an adult. Like, is it all the same though? And if it's not, why is it not? Like, why do we experience that differently, particularly as we become, I think, more aware of our intersecting identities? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to kind of questions about your college experience now. I see that you majored in history of science at Harvard while on the pre-med track, which is very impressive. What made you interested in this major? Oh, I'm sorry. I can't really hear you.
Like, humanities, social sciences, and the sciences. And I had a lot of difficulty trying to decide you know, between those things, between all of those things. And so I saw, yeah, an opportunity in history of science, which is like a very distinct major. It's not offered at most universities. Um, I saw an opportunity there to not have to choose, basically. But after I had chosen that path, I very much have come to appreciate the fact that it did teach me in a way that was like, what's the word for it? Interdisciplinary. Um, and I think that it has actually, in very profound ways, influenced my worldview, in kind of like a meta way, right? So it's like, I think in general, I value more than many might, um, the kind of polymath or the Renaissance person, having multiple lenses on issues in society, and on my own life. I think it's been really, really helpful to me, to understand myself in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of going back, you said that there were a multitude of majors that you were interested in. And so what were other subjects that you were interested in studying along with like the major that you ended up choosing?
Gosh, I mean, I think that I at one time considered Spanish language and literature. I love I love literature. I love to read. I love writing. I speak Spanish better than I do Korean, because I was like raised in large part by like a number of Central American like nannies while my parents were both working, when I was younger. And that was one of the things. And I actually did get a certificate. So that was one of the things I was considering. I think I was considering social studies, which, I think there is a lot of overlap, honestly, between social studies and the path that I chose. It is also, I think, in many ways interdisciplinary. Um, And yeah, I mean, I feel like the disciplines that I was looking at for the most part were, although I've never, I guess, explicitly articulated this really, they were a way at looking at what I had learned in the past, and I think how most people understand the world around them with a really critical lens, right? Had I chosen something like biochemistry, right, or physics, and these things actually were never on my, they were never in my decision calculus. I was never considering doing a major in biochemistry or physics. Although I really liked, not necessarily biochemistry. I liked chemistry. I loved biology, and I liked physics a lot as well. But I did not consider those majors because I did not think that um, they would help to cultivate like a more profound understanding of the world,
Mm.
for me, right? I think I thought of those disciplines more as like challenging, of course, like the content is challenging to learn. Um, but yeah, I wasn't seeking to be challenged in that way. I think I was seeking to really understand the world from multiple perspectives. And so, it wasn't those disciplines that appealed to me.
Mm.
But I did. Oh, the other part of taking history of science is that it allowed me to knock out my pre-med requirements. So that's the other like, practical reality is
Yeah.
that what can I take as a major where I don't have to take a bunch of additional electives and I'll get my pre-med requirements knocked out.
Yeah.
So
That's great. What were some also like defining moments that you had in college? I'm sorry, that's kind of general as well, but yeah.
um, yeah, that's a good question. I think the realization that people, and I think for this, I'm really grateful, have always been very grateful to Harvard, and I'm sure a number of other schools have commitments similarly, but I was very grateful to have a really diverse set of classmates. Um, and I think also I seek that out. So it's not even necessarily Harvard per se. Like I think that if it weren't me, it might have been a student who elected to spend their time with a more homogeneous group. But I'm always seeking, again, like, I mean, I think of people in my life, whether they're friendships or they're, professional networks that I attempt to develop, they, to me, are, they're a gift. They allow me to almost live multiple lives through other people's experiences. And so, being in college where I ended up hanging out with, a Korean American who was from Chicago and actually was born on the same exact date that I was born in 1979. He was like a world traveled concert pianist, performed with the Chicago Symphony when he was 13. I mean, he was just brilliant. But he was very humble. He was hilarious. He was a second generation immigrant whose parents never really learned to speak English. And so he was negotiating like, the purchase of their house when he was like, in middle school. Um, I mean, just some extraordinary people. Another friend of mine was a first generation immigrant who came to the United States when he was 8, I think. They escaped from Cuba on a boat and ended up in Florida. And his parents both worked in a factory in California, and he was at Harvard. Another friend of mine, his parents did not complete college degrees, but his father ended up being actually one of the executives at a big oil and gas company, and he ended up, my friend actually ended up again at Harvard, right? And so, yeah, another friend of mine is like Argentinian American. She had spent like the summer at like the presidential palace in Argentina because she won some like prize in a program or whatever. And yeah, and so like these people who had done really extraordinary things, but they didn't quite come from privileged backgrounds per se. Yeah, I mean, most of them didn't. I didn't really spend time with, the 14th generation Harvard student. Um, I knew some of them, but I didn't. Those were not the people I sought out um, yeah, to cultivate relationships with. So I think that was maybe the most impactful thing, is just kind of the relationships that I had, and that I cultivated with people, with my peers there.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so moving on to kind of your medical and PhD experience, I see you received your MD and PhD in neuroscience from Baylor College of Medicine. What was kind of this experience of medical school like?
Um, Medical school. So I did 2 years of medical school before taking what I thought would be 1 year off to do research. And the first 2 years of medical school, I think I was a decent student. I was what medical students call a gunner. Basically like someone who is just like rabidly competitive, right? And I wasn't that way in that I was not like sabotaging people, but I was often trying to just put on display my knowledge, right? I definitely was doing that. And I was also doing that in order to help other students as well. So like I started like a website where I would drop a bunch of my notes and I would collect notes from other students who also wanted to share the materials they had created for people to study from. And so I would put it to service to help other people. But at the end of the day, I think it was very ego driven, right? Like, look what I've done and I'm so smart. um, I mean, I think there was just a bit of immaturity about me, and maybe that was because I felt maybe it was driven by insecurity. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't one of those like hard science majors, and so I felt I was a little bit at a disadvantage when I started medical school. So I don't know if my showboatness, I don't know what to call it, my being a showboat, had to do with insecurity, but that's certainly how I was for the first couple of years. And then I took this year off in order to do some research in a neuroscience lab and really discovered that I loved research, and I didn't have a chance to figure that out as an undergrad. I did a little bit of research as an undergrad, but it was not in the right environment. It wasn't with the right mentorship. They weren't asking the right research questions, like for me to have taken an interest at that time. But the lab where I ended up after 2 years of medical school, I was really like so captivated by the work they were doing and also by the community of scientists that were gathered in that particular lab. And so I was really impressed and kind of questioning like whether I really wanted to be in medicine, honestly. So what I ended up doing is negotiating to take more time off to join the MD PhD program. So I was the first student they actually had that transitioned from this 1 year research program that they have at Baylor College of Medicine into the MD PhD program. They had students before who wanted to do it, but they didn't allow it until I asked. I think I was maybe the third person who asked to do it. And so they let me transition into that program, and I ended up completing a PhD in that work that I started that first year. And I think coming back to medical school after that experience, I was obviously much older. By that time I had 2 children, and so I did not have the same attitude that like I needed to show the world how knowledgeable I was. I mean, I knew how knowledgeable I was, and also at that point, I think I understood how knowledgeable I wasn't, right? And I think that's what you do really understand pretty exquisitely if you do grad school right. It's that the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. And so that kind of humility, I think, was really helpful. Going back to medical school, I did have some trouble readjusting, I think, because I was so comfortable with what I feel was the culture of science. I don't know if this is true or if it was just a product of the laboratory that I was in, because I don't think this is universally true. Talking to colleagues of mine who ended up in other labs or in different institutions, it's not universally true that they have like this wonderful experience and they think that the community is like so, you know, I don't know, like rich and supportive and like thought provoking. And people do not uniformly have that experience in science, but I did. And so I had this notion that like science was this idyllic place. Medicine was this like hyper hierarchical, all about like memorization and regurgitation of information, no critical thought, just very toxic in a lot of ways. And that's kind of the perspective, the lens that I had on medicine going back to medical school and then starting residency. I tried to quit residency twice. because I just felt like I didn't belong after having done grad school and having had such a different experience that I just wanted to go back. I was like, I just want to go back to science. I really detest this. I don't want to practice medicine. I don't want to be around these people. But, you know, I stuck with it. A lot of people told me I should stick with it for mostly practical reasons. They were like, you don't want to have put in all of this effort and to have basically a path to economic security, at least, that you're just going to throw away if you don't complete the training. And so I listened to them, you know, for better or worse. I think that I would have done fine to not listen to them, but I chose to listen to those voices. And yeah, and I'm happy with where I've ended up. But anyway, yeah, so that was kind of my experience in medical school and the remainder of my medical training.
Yeah, so now we're gonna kind of transition into, like, how did you decide to pursue your current career? And please take us through the progression of your career if you transition through different positions.
Sure. So currently I'm the director of scientific affairs of an EEG diagnostics company. EEG is our brainwave studies that are done principally on people where there's some suspicion that they may have epilepsy or seizures. But we do them for a lot of other reasons as well. And namely, right now, there's been, like, in the last decade or so, incredible interest in doing these studies on critically ill patients who are obtunded or otherwise, like, their consciousness is impaired or altered. We do, you know, we measure their brain waves basically to see what is happening in the brain. And we've found when we've done this at scale that there are a lot of people who actually are having seizures when they're critically ill, even if they don't have brain illness as their reason for being critically ill. Like, they may be there because they have, like, kidney failure or something else, but a large number of them actually are having seizures that go undetected unless you're measuring it. And so since they've discovered this, it's become a whole industry, right? So now there are companies that are trying to offer to measure and to read and interpret, have physicians read and interpret the studies. So I joined this company in 2015, I think, as a medical advisor. And at that time, I was finishing up my training in fellowship in epilepsy and EEG. And then I thought that I was going to stay in academic medicine. I had really, I think, an unfortunate negotiation or lack thereof with the man who would have been my chairman, where I would have ended up as a professor. Yeah, I mean, I guess I won't really go into the details of that right now, but I will say that it really opened my eyes up to the uphill battle for women and for people of color in academia. And I was really blind to it. I remember actually very explicitly thinking that, you know, at some level, yes, we do need programs to support, you know, students from communities of color, otherwise disadvantaged students. And I was very active actually on that front. I was often participating in, like, mentorship programs and, like, outreach programs and things like this in science in grad school. But I think part of me also thought, like, you know, at some point you just have to be good enough and you have to work hard enough, and then there shouldn't be any barriers. But when I attempted to negotiate this position with my chairman, where I came in a very favorable position. I mean, I had multiple first author publications. I had an MD PhD. I had independent funding for 2 years. I mean, I had so many things, right? And objectively, you could look at that resume and say, this person is going to be very successful in academic medicine. And I was just, I mean, I felt like I was just taken as a joke, what I was offered, how I was treated, and realized finally in that moment, I mean, I should have realized it far before then, that no, it doesn't actually ever go away. This problem of misogyny, of racism, those attitudes, they are at the very top of the food chain. And so I left academic medicine. And at that time, like I said, I was in touch with this company and I was doing it. I was a medical advisor at that time. I asked them if they could create a position for me, basically. And they said yes. They created a position, and I came on as director of medical and scientific affairs at that time because they were small enough and they couldn't afford to have two different people in those positions at that time. They didn't have enough work for it. They didn't have the money to support it. So I filled both of those roles for 3 years. And then in 2019, last year, I transitioned out of the director of medical affairs role, and somebody else transitioned into that role, a colleague of mine. And then now I'm exclusively focused on scientific work for the company. So I do a lot of clinical trials work, wearing my science hat. And then I also do a lot of clinical reading still of EEGs in the company. And because I've been there for many years and since, the early days, I'm also just I continue to wear multiple hats in the company, and I'm engaged with, the executives in the company because I've been there for a long time.
So yeah, that's a little disheartening to hear about like your experiences through the industry, but were there any mentors that really helped you along the way?
That's a good question. I have always sought mentorship. I've never thought that would come from a single person. And again, I think this is because my worldview is just that the more information that you have, the more opportunity that you have to decide what path is best for you, right? Every person is unique, and we're also dynamic as human beings. So like what might have been good for me at one point in my life might not be good for me now. And so I think it's important to have many, many mentors. So I can't point to a single person who gave me advice. There were a number of people that I went to get different perspectives on like what action I should take when I faced some of these challenges. And it was pretty traumatizing for me because for about a decade, I thought I would be a physician scientist in academia. And then to get such a ridiculous offer, and really no firm commitment to support my development as a physician scientist. And you absolutely need that to be successful. I was like, I'm not going to throw away 5 years of my life in attempting to move from instructor to assistant professor to associate professor, when I know that you're not going to give me the time or the resources to devote to that path to do it successfully. So I was just like, I'm not going to do that. And then to walk away from it, yes, at one level I was like, yeah, power, right? Like I'm walking away from the situation. They're really trying to pull one over on me. But on the other hand, it was a real shock. It was really unsettling to who I thought I was. Like I really had to kind of understand who I was, my identity, outside of being a physician scientist in academia, because that's how I saw myself for so long,
Right.
But I think it was good for me. I mean, it allowed me to learn how to pivot. It allowed me to expand my networks beyond academia. It allowed me to become very comfortable with actually being in very different environments, which I think has served me very well in the work that I've done, both in the work that I do now for Corticare, the EEG diagnostics company, but I think even more importantly, or as importantly, the work that I do outside of my paid labor, which are kind of my labors of love. And that's a lot of the work that I do in organizing, community organizing and advocacy in our communities.
Yeah, so as you mentioned some of the barriers that you faced, why do you think they still exist today?
Yeah, this is a good question. There's a fantastic book that I started reading by a scholar named Ibram X. I don't know if that's how he pronounced his name, X Kendi. He writes often for The Atlantic, and he's written several books as well. He's I think, professor of Africana Studies. And the book I'm reading now is called Stamped from the Beginning. And it talks about racism in America, but it actually starts with like the beginnings of Western intellectual thought, and how a lot of these problems we see with racism, and I think that in many ways this is also true for sexism or any otherism, right? Like cissexism or heterosexism or bigotry against people who are disabled or whatever it is, right? Any deviation from what somebody has established as quote unquote the norm, right? I think that these ideas are very problematic. For a long time, I thought that we could educate our way out of those ideas, or we could cultivate compassion among people. At some level, you're born with some of these things, and you have, you're more compassionate than like the person sitting next to you. Yes, I think that that is true also. But I did have this hope that that some of it was teachable. And this book ideas, and actually kind of what's the word for it, like reframing those ideas or repackaging those ideas over time, in order to maintain power.
Mm.
And it is true. If you look back at it, I think it's a really compelling argument that, like, there's another author named Michelle Alexander who wrote The New Jim Crow, which was turned into a documentary called 13th, right? And she talks about how, like, slavery has really just what's the word? It's oh my gosh, the word is escaping me. It's like when you come back in a second life. What is this word? I can't believe that I'm forgetting this.
I have the book, but
Yeah, no. She doesn't talk. I don't know if she actually uses this particular word, reincarnation, right? So slavery is reincarnated, right? This is my word. I don't know that she's ever used it, but in this way. But the idea is the same. It's reinvented, right? From slavery to like Jim Crow to mass incarceration, right? So like this kind of thing, it started happening from before slavery, is the argument that Kendi makes, and I totally buy it, right? There is something that's very seductive about power, and I think once people have it, they do what they can to manipulate people through ideas, and through institutions that allow them to hang on to it. And so, yeah, I don't know. Now I forget your original question that I.
It was just about the barriers and why they still exist, but I think that was I think that addresses the original question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I heard that you have 2 daughters. Was it difficult to kind of balance the work and life balance with children?
I wish that I could say that it was difficult, because I think that that is the circumstance for most people. I was very fortunate because I live where my parents are and where my husband's parents are, and my husband also is like enormously supportive. So, and he had the flexibility to do a lot of the childcare when I was going through, especially my medical school and residency years. During grad school, I think I did a lot of it because I had the time and flexibility, and I wanted to. I mean, I think I always want to, but during med school and residency, it was hard to be the primary caretaker. So that fell to my husband. But I understand that many people are not in that circumstance. I was actually really kind of irritated when I was interviewing for residency programs. I was at the Harvard Mass Eye Infirmary, or it's their principal hospital for ophthalmology residency training. So originally, before I went into neurology, I thought I wanted to be an ophthalmologist and actually applied in ophthalmology. And then my husband didn't want us to leave Houston, and I wanted to go to a particular program that was very research oriented anyway. So I didn't end up following through on applying in ophthalmology. But I was interviewing at this program at Harvard, and there was a resident there. When I asked her like how difficult residency was with her, because she had children too, with children, she said, "Oh, it's not been so hard because my mom moved here." It's like, okay, well, my mom is not going to move to Boston. She's working, and like, she loves me, but she's not going to move to Boston to raise my children. And that's basically what this woman told me. And I was like, that's really unhelpful.
Right. Oh my gosh.
So from that perspective, I think the relevant question here is not like, was it difficult for you? Or because it wasn't, but that's not most people's circumstance, right? And
Right.
I think that the relevant advice then to people, to the majority of the world who actually struggles with this, for women especially, because this is still, child rearing still remains highly gendered. I think the relevant advice is, don't ever be unhappy with a B plus. Like, you're going to be juggling many things, and don't try to be that person who has an A in everything, right? Be happy that you have the privilege, to the opportunity, to not only pursue your career, but to have a family, right? To make a family and be okay with the fact that you're going to get B's sometimes. And
Yeah.
that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you kind of juggle your busy schedule?
Um, Gosh. Uh, I guess this is more relevant now because, like, after getting COVID, I've actually had to really slow down. I physically, I'm requiring a lot more sleep than I normally do. Normally, I actually only
Mm-hmm.
sleep like anywhere from like 3 to 5 hours a night. I actually sleep
Mm-hmm.
very little. But after getting COVID in March, I've required so much more sleep that I've had to figure out what to do with less time. um, and yeah, so I think what is important is that you just be very intentional about your time, right? And I think that's especially true now when we're working from home and the boundaries aren't so discrete, right? So it's
Right.
like, whereas we used to like go to school or go to work, and when we came home we can disconnect from that at least a little bit. Now it's harder for many people. Now I work from home, so I've had this issue since for many years, but I think for many people, they're kind of struggling to figure out, how do you create those boundaries to make sure that you can, be attentive to all of the things that you value, right? Because otherwise you can certainly let certain activities bleed into the other activities that you also value. And you want to give, sufficient time to everything, right? Time is, uh,
Sorry, I think you're frozen. Oh, oh, you're good now. Sorry for.
oh, sorry.
You're all good.
Where did it cut off?
Uh, when you start talking about time and kind of focusing your time.
Yeah, so I think the advice I wanted to give there is that, it's important to be intentional about your time, to set boundaries, around it, and to realize that, your time is valuable, right? So, um, I have the problem of like saying yes to everything.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm s- I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Oh,
Talking about something that we want to do together, right? Some kind of collective effort, and somebody says, well, it would be really great if we could do this, and nobody volunteers themselves. I cannot handle that silence. I would volunteer myself. And it's awful
no.
because I end up doing things where I think my skill set and my resources are not best utilized. But because I just can't handle there being silence, I insert myself into things like this. I volunteer myself for things that I shouldn't. And I think that that is another, it's another way to be, yeah, to protect your time, is to be cognizant of that kind of, compulsion, maybe.
Yeah. So, what are some values that you consider important that you might be instilling in your children that may have not been communicated by your parents?
Gosh, that's hard because I feel like the most important value I've like learned in my life came from my parents, and I think it
Oh,
really fundamentally informs how I raise my children and how I think about the world. So, something that did not come from my parents is really hard. I'm gonna still stick with actually the thing that came from them, because in some ways it is actually, because it's kind of one of these meta observations or like a meta piece of advice, it is actually something that creates the space for things that have not come from them. So what they told me, I remember very distinctly, and I often talk about this, when I was 16, I think, we had this conversation where they said that there are things that, ideas that they have and customs that they have brought with them from Korea, which is where they came from. And while some of those things may be relevant to me and to how I live my life, some of those things will not be relevant. And the corollary to that is that things that I learn here, customs, practices, attitudes, values, that I learned here in this country may be more relevant to my life here in this country. And so I have to figure out what things to keep and what things to discard. And that's the advice they gave me, which is not, I mean, it's not the kind of advice that I think most people give, right? Most people give this very discreet advice, and they have, like, there is ego that is attached.
I'm sorry. I think you froze again.
Oh gosh. Am I
Oh,
back?
you're good now. You're back. You're back. Okay, you're
Okay,
good.
sorry. Where did it cut off?
It it cut off. I think you were talking about. Sorry, I don't know.
That's okay. It's I was in general talking about the advice that my parents gave me. I was trying to say that it was like not directional in the way that most people would give
Yes,
advice.
I think that's where you cut. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
When you,
Yeah,
that's where you cut.
it was more like, you know, you're going to have to figure it out yourself, but it's not that open, right? It's not that open-ended. That's not advice, really. It was to say that there are some things that you inherit that are valuable, right? So you have to figure out what those things are. And there are some things that you inherit that are not relevant for the context that you're in. And you have to figure out what those things are. They didn't tell me what those things are, because that's a judgment that I have to make myself. And that was very empowering to me. Like it was remarkably empowering to me, and I think has really shaped how I live my life and how I've raised my children, how I think about society, I mean, I'm very anti-paternalism, I think, because of this, right? Because my parents did not raise me like that, which is unusual. I mean, in some ways they did. There were definitely, I can definitely give you anecdotes where I'm like, oh my God, that was so paternalistic, or they were so like all over me about this or that. But I think at the end of the day, the overarching theme was like, you're going to have to figure this out, right? And just understand that not everything that comes from your parents, not everything that you historically inherit from society, not everything is bad, but not everything is relevant anymore. So you have to figure it out. And that was like the best advice.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Say that again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Okay, great. Okay. So I see you that from your website, you're running for the PISD Board of Trustees, and it shows that you have a deep interest in equal opportunity of education for people of color and immigrants. What kind of drove you towards running for this position?
So
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I think I can't. Sorry, I can't hear. Um. Oh, okay. I think you're back.
Okay. Hey, hon, are you on a call right now, or can you like not be streaming things, or tell the girls not to be streaming things? Like, this is super unstable and they're recording something right now. Okay. Okay, sorry. What was the question?
Oh, so I see you running for the PISD Board of Trustees, and your website shows that you have a deep interest in advocating for equal opportunity of education for people of color and immigrants. What kind of drove you towards running for this position?
Right. So what I was
Uh,
okay.
okay. Um,
Is it back?
yeah, it's back now.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. No.
Yeah, so I'm not running for
Oh,
Pearland ISD School Board this year. I ran last year. I just haven't
oh,
updated
okay.
the website. But the fundamental question, I think, is about how I got interested in running for school board, right?
Right.
Yeah, so there were a couple of things. In 2017, I actually had become very active. 2016, 2017, I had become very active in immigration advocacy and had been doing a lot of work around Know Your Rights trainings, which is basically teaching immigrant families, immigrant youth, how to keep themselves safe, basically, in encounters with law enforcement. And that's just kind of acknowledging the reality that we have a lot of anti-immigrant policy and anti-immigrant attitudes even that we have to protect ourselves from. And so I wanted to be a part of educating people on how to do that. And at the same time, I was doing a lot of advocacy in parallel around changing the system that produced those kinds of attitudes or rewarded those kinds of attitudes and to dismantle those kinds of laws. But anyway, I went to the school board because I knew that our school district had a lot of immigrant families here. And we had just passed legislation in 2017 called SB4. It's like an anti-sanctuary state law, which allows local law enforcement to engage with immigration and customs enforcement federally. It ends up that local law enforcement will racially profile people who they believe might be immigrants. And they can pull them over, they can question them about their immigration status. And so I wanted to make sure that the families in Pearland, where my children are, that they were safe, because I was doing this work all over Greater Houston, and in fact had gotten involved in work also across the state and nationally on this. And so I was like, well, you know, I should be active in my own community. I'm not doing anything in Pearland where I live. And so I went before the school board at that time to suggest that we provide Know Your Rights trainings to families. And I provided the rationale for why that was the moment to do it, to start doing it. And it just fell on deaf ears. And I mean, it was an all, well, there's one African-American man on the board at that time. It was otherwise an all white board. And I was like, they don't have the lived experience of like being an immigrant in this country, especially in this particular moment. And so I need to, yeah, I need to maybe address that at some point. And so by 2019, I decided after, in addition to having that experience, having actually personal experiences with my children and the children of my friends, having various kinds of issues with this district, I was like, we need better leadership in the district. And if nobody is going to step up to run against these incumbents, and at the time there were, I think, 3 seats that were going to go unchallenged. And I just believe that that is bad for democracy to have unchallenged incumbents like that. At least somebody should throw their name in the hat, right? I mean, even if you don't campaign or anything at all. So I decided I was going to run. And usually when I decide on something, it's not like I was, you know, super excited about it. I never really thought, I never really cared for trying to evolve. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's that there is an environment externally that is forcing that organism to evolve. And so it's like, I don't want to be on the inside, because those people on the inside, they're not the real change agents. But then I was like, but I don't want these seats to go unchallenged. And certainly you do need people on the inside to be receptive to the pressure from the outside. So I decided to run. And like I said, I wasn't super thrilled about doing it, but when I commit to something, I mean, this is how I end up doing so much of what I do in my life. Like I said, I feel like I can't,
Right.
that space, I can't let it just go unoccupied. And so I usually will volunteer for things, but what I find is that once I do it, because of just who I am all in.
Right.
And so, you know, I raised like $30,000. I mean, you have to raise, to be competitive in Texas, on average, you have to raise around $20,000 in a school board race.
Okay.
So I raised like 30,000. You know, we touched like either called or canvassed at their doors, like 20,000 people, 25,000 people, an enormous number of people. And I hired a campaign manager. I had a campaign staff. I lived my values and paid those people $15 an hour because that's what I believe people should be paid, at least right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and after all of that, they, like the incumbents and the political machine here that really owns local government, that they're all connected through business, through their faith communities, and they own local government. Those folks put out, I mean, just a horrifying, super unprofessional, entirely unethical campaign of disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had people calling me Dr. Wonton. I had, we had emails that went out in mass with our faces on the email and an ISIS flag in the background trying to tie us to terrorism. And it's just like, I mean, I thought it was a joke. At first I thought it was a joke. And then I was deeply offended for our Muslim community here because I mean, it's so intolerant of religious minority communities. And I was just like, this is horrifying. I can't even believe that. I mean, I run this uber professional campaign. I put out videos like daily so that people can try to connect to who I am and not just misunderstand me because they have no substrate, right? Like they have nothing to go off of. So I'm like, I'm going to put out videos. I'm going to engage frequently. I'm going to offer to meet people in person whenever there is any, you know, what appears to be misunderstanding. I mean, I was very forthcoming. I was, I think, very professional, very kind, very compassionate. And that's what they did. I mean, they said that they put messaging out there that I wanted to fire all white teachers, that I don't care if white kids get killed, that, I mean, so many absurd and just terrible, terrible things, because I think because they were scared, honestly. Again, it's about, you know, doing whatever you have to do in order to hold on to power. And I think that's what it was. They saw here actually somebody who could unseat the people that they had put into place. And so that, you know, went however it went. But what I was very proud of is that we put in, you know, a really genuine effort to build our community, to change the narrative around a lot of the injustices that we see in our community, that we continue to see in our community. We learned how to engage with the press very effectively, to where we were able to change things even without us being on the school board, because we learned how to publicly engage, to where there was political pressure on the school board members to change certain policies. So, I mean, that's what I want at the end of the day. I'm not seeking like fame or glory because I have my name on some plaque or something as a school board member. I mean, I could care less. Most of what I do in my life, I feel like that I feel is important, I do without acknowledgement. I don't talk about it necessarily, except to maybe a very small number of people. And that is not what I'm seeking to do. I'm seeking for change to happen, for people to be empowered, to be a part of that change making. I'm not seeking credit.
Yeah, that's really scary to hear what people will do to kind of keep their power, or like when they feel like threatened by other people. Yeah. So your website also talks about your interest in kind of mental health. What is kind of your perception of Asian Americans as like this model minority, and therefore kind of they're told to shun away from seeking mental health support, even when there might be a need?
Oh my gosh, I missed most of that. Can you hear me right now?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry. I can.
Yeah, you
repeat
said
that.
that the website talks about mental health, and then I lost you. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So yes, I saw on your website that you have an interest in kind of mental health. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about the perception of Asian Americans as this model minority, and therefore we kind of shun away from seeking mental health support even when there may be a need for it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you framed it in that way because I don't normally think about it like that. But certainly, I think it is a disservice to um, all people in our communities that we inherit this myth, right? And I mean, I think to be fair, um, there are many people in our communities who perpetuate the myth. They so they do play an active role in that. But yeah, it is a disservice to us as whole human beings because it suggests that we are like superhuman, right? That we work harder than others, that we're smarter than others, that whatever the case may be, right?
Mhm,
That
mhm, mhm.
and I um, I think it's really unfortunate. I think that it really will take work from within our communities to address that and to dismantle that. But I think it will also take work between our communities and other minority communities to help dismantle that myth. Because I think um, some of the toxicity comes from ideas that are also perpetuated by people outside of our communities, right? Not people who invented the myth necessarily, but again, people who have adopted it and they believe it. And, you know, for better or worse, right? They may have a positive impression of you because of that myth, or they may have a negative one because of that myth. And I think myths are bad in that way, like because um, it denies your individuality, right, and your humanity in a lot of ways, and it just kind of marks you as a type, right?
Mhm.
And yeah, and I think mental illness is like it's a real thing that I think people are just now beginning to take seriously, you know, with parity in terms of like how they regard mental health versus physical health. When I Are you still with me here?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, where did I blank out?
You didn't blank out. Your voice was there, but your video froze, but I think that's okay.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, when I ran for school board, I realized that, I mean, I was very pleased to realize this actually, because it was an idea that I had in my head that it did not come from where I discovered it when I was running, but I discovered that the CDC at the time, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they had a whole like um, I don't know what it's called. I don't know. It's not a campaign, but it's kind of like a framework for thinking about um, how we educate children and that it should be holistic, right? So that's how I ran my campaign. Actually, is like
Mhm.
I am a candidate who will push for policies that are fundamentally informed by this idea of whole child health. That the way we educate children should not be exclusively about cognitive development or academic achievement, but it should very much integrate, um, you know, how much we value or should value the social and emotional development of children, which includes their mental health, right, and well-being. And we had a real problem with that in our district because we had a number of suicides. Like our suicide rate was like several fold higher than the average for the country. And so yeah, that was a big deal. And we do have also a very large Asian American community. I don't know actually the racial or ethnic identity of the kids who committed suicide beyond a couple of them. One of them was there was an attempt that where the child was biracial and half Asian, but it is a big problem in our communities. I think also there's a lot of silence and shame about those kinds of issues,
Mhm.
and that's I think independent of the model minority myth. I think that even if you go to East Asian or even Southeast Asian countries, there will be a lot of those same kinds of cultural attitudes.
Right.
So we're facing a lot of intersecting challenges, I think, in terms of how we deal with mental health in our communities.
Right. I'm going to shift into kind of the COVID questions. You mentioned that you had contracted COVID. Um, what was kind of that experience? like?
It's been really frustrating, right? Because
Mhm.
thank God I'm a physician, because
Right.
and that I have just kind of confidence in my own ability to assess a situation and my situation. But I started exhibiting symptoms when they were not testing widely.
Mm.
I went to a community where I was exposed to someone who had been exposed to a person who was a person, what they call a person under investigation.
Mm. Mm.
Ultimately, when they realized, oh, this might be, and like, this is the woman who works at a hotel desk where they have a lot of international travelers.
Oh.
And so they're like, this might be this disease that everybody's talking about everywhere. And yeah, so it was just coming into their consciousness that this could be a problem in their community. And so it never occurred to anyone to test me. Like, at that time when I came back to Houston, they were not testing here any people who had not traveled
Oh.
internationally,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Or had very specific symptoms. And I was like, I don't really get this, because when I look at the literature, like the literature from Wuhan,
Mhm.
it was like tens of thousands of people. They had described such a multitude of symptoms, right? Like, just kind of a syndrome across many different organ systems, including me.
Oh. Oh. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Okay. So you froze when you were talking about the organs in the body being targeted by COVID throughout the body.
Right. But the screening they were doing here, at least early on, was
Mhm.
very focused on like the most common symptoms.
I
And I'm
see.
like, I mean, I understand why you might want to start with the most common symptoms at like the top of your list, but you
Yeah.
ought to have a list, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not just like 3 of the 20. Like, you should just list them all and ask people, do they have any of these? Because they were manifest in so many people in China.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then also in Italy. And I'm like, we have so many examples internationally of like, what is happening to people with this disease? Why are we like creating like
Right.
all of this anew? And so I was really frustrated. So I didn't actually get a diagnosis of this from PCR testing, because I didn't test, or which is like the nasal swab test. I
Mhm.
didn't test for it until well into my symptoms. And, from what limited literature exists on this, the longer you wait, the less likely it is that you're going to have a positive test.
I
So
see.
I had all these symptoms, but I never had a positive, like, PCR confirmed diagnosis, right? Or
I
test
see.
confirmed diagnosis. And yeah, and so I was like in the middle of having this illness. And in fact, I mean, I knew about this illness in January, because I had friends who were like freaked out about their families. I mean,
Mm.
with good reason, about their families in Wuhan. And so I was hearing a lot about it. And then I was like, oh my gosh, it's coming here. Like, if there was a case in Washington, I was like, we have to be prepared for it. And so I held actually the first, to my knowledge, it was the first like community COVID forum in Pearland in Greater Houston. And so I held that like on March 5th, I think. And so in the midst of doing all this like education and organizing and advocacy around COVID, like, I get COVID, which was
Right.
frustrating and ironic. And like, and then I can't even get a diagnosis for it, right? And so then it's like, well, do people even believe me that I have this illness? I mean, I was like sleeping like much more than I normally do. And I had this constellation of symptoms. It wasn't the typical stuff
Right.
at all. Uh,
Right.
and I've continued to have it. Like, I've had to go to in May, I had to go to the ER like 2 days in a row. They almost hospitalized me. I got like 3
Gosh.
different brain and head scans. On Monday of this past week, I had to go get another like brain vessel study, because I had another like sudden onset neurological symptom. I'm somebody who's like a prolific writer, and I have had difficulty writing. I noticed that I make a lot of mistakes. At the beginning, I was like substituting words. So like, I would choose like before instead of between, which made no sense in the
Right.
context, right? And now I'm just making what maybe some people think are typos, typographical errors, which that would be generous because I don't think they're typos. I think there's something that is not right about the way I'm thinking that is not allowing me to express myself as readily as I was able to before. So I still write quite a bit, but I find myself making a lot of mistakes. I have to check my writing much more. Yeah. So, I mean, I've had actually a lot of neurological symptoms. And I actually have had a history of a brain infection. So there might be something about my brain that is just more vulnerable somehow. At that time, they thought it was like a cold virus that had gone to my brain, like maybe through my nose or something like that. But yeah, I had like an encephalitis. Like I was out for like a week. I don't remember that week of my life.
Oh my gosh.
So I think that whatever is happening with COVID now, the fact that it's manifesting in the way that it is in me, I think it might be particular to me. Although the literature does show like pretty pervasive reports of neurological symptoms, like up to like 30% of people have some kind of neurological symptom that they're reporting. And if you include things like fatigue, which, you know, I don't know that I really count that as neurological, but it's much more. Like fatigue is one of the most common symptoms in COVID, especially post-COVID.
Right.
So.
Wow. So on the same kind of idea, what do you think about the whole, like the way that in which the government has chosen to handle the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much, I think in kind of the crisis of leadership at many levels of government that I see, it's an inability to admit error. It's a reluctance to characterize in terms of like nuanced realities as opposed to absolutes. People tend to lead in absolutes. They tend to message in absolutes. And I think it's because it is galvanizing to voters often, right? Like if you say, well, I don't take this position exactly, like on this binary, right? I'm not exactly there. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle for these reasons. Like that is not as compelling as like, I'm here because of this. I have this conviction. I mean, that is what you traditionally think in terms of leadership, right? Like somebody who is they have strong convictions, right? And they're going to see them through. And, you know, they have just like, values that cannot be undermined, right? Like this is kind of what most people I think have traditionally thought of in terms of leadership. And these things are very problematic. When you have a pandemic that you do not understand, right? And you're constantly having to reevaluate and to pivot, you cannot be operating in absolutes. You cannot, and you have to be able to say, I was wrong there. The reason we are changing course is because I was wrong. And it's because science is evolving, right?
Right.
And sometimes it's because you're an evil person and you made the, you know, a calculated evil error. But, you know, I try to be generous. I think mostly it's not that. I think that at the highest levels, it might be some of that. I think it is political posturing, political calculation. And that I think is very unfortunate. But I think the majority of Americans, that's not why they're behaving in the way they're behaving. It's that. And are you there?
Oh, yes. Sorry. You paused at talking about why certain people are behaving the way they're behaving.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what I said there, but what I wanted to go on to say is that I mean, is to kind of just like close with it being really a lack of humility in leadership. And I think it is I mean, it's also, unfortunately, systems that we've created or attitudes that we've created over a long period of time where people do not feel empowered to change the lack of leadership, right? Like they don't feel empowered in that they don't actually know that there is any avenue for change, right? Like they don't know how to engage the systems around them They don't know how power maps in their communities. Who holds
Right.
the power? Who do you go to when you have a problem? People don't understand these things, and it's been very intentional by people who have held power in the last several decades. They have very intentionally divested or disinvested from educating the populace, right, in terms of like civic literacy.
Right.
And that's a real problem, because then when you're in a crisis and you have poor leadership, right, then how do you get yourself out of that crisis but for the populace to understand how to come together and to act collectively to basically rescue the situation, right? That can only happen when there is enough people, there are enough people who are civically literate, who can organize their communities and take collective action. And I'm hoping that there are currently enough of us that have learned enough, especially over the last 4 years when there's been like a super like strong anti-Trump reaction, that there is a way out of this, that a lot of these problems are actually long-standing problems. Yeah, and that you know, we can organize ourselves out of this problem, and hopefully we stay committed to it, because you know, organizing ourselves out of the pandemic, organizing ourselves out of a Trump presidency, this is all very transient. Like, we have to understand that this is a long-term investment in basically shifting the culture of civic consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was very well put. But do you think there has been enough Asian Americans like participating in recent events related to protests for racial injustice, such as Black Lives Matter, response to COVID, like racism against Asian Americans, and kind of the current administration's handling of international students? Sorry, that was a long question.
Yeah, no, but there are a lot of things going on. I always wish for more. I mean, I think this is like a function of being progressively minded. It's like we can always do better, and I think that is, you know, true invariably, including for Asian Americans. So yeah, I mean, there are things that are disappointing to me about our communities, and that we are not as politically engaged as others are. But at the same time, you know, we haven't been here collectively as long as some of these other communities have been here, right? So like, Latinos have been here, some of them, before this country was founded, right? Like in Texas, we have people who have been here since this land belonged to Mexico or to Spain, or like, right? And you know, people who are Black in America, other than Black immigrants, new Black immigrants, are, you know, the descendants of slaves. They've been here for 400 years, right? So it is unfair to say like that I expect us to be in the same place in terms of our political consciousness, as Asian Americans. That being said, I feel like we have an opportunity to learn from like our brothers and sisters in other communities, right? To hopefully accelerate our consciousness, right? And for us to become more aware and more involved in our communities. It's also difficult, I think, for us because, and this was actually in some part driven by us, or maybe even in large part driven by Asian Americans. There was a decision, just like for Latinos, to kind of collectively identify as Hispanic, right? Or as Latino. It gives you political power. And so we've done that as Asian Americans. I mean, there are various acronyms that describe us. The one that I most commonly use is AAPI, which is Asian American Pacific Islander, but people use a number of different ones to be more inclusive, typically, and to be more nuanced. And I think that it's been difficult because we are very heterogeneous. Like, not only do we come from different countries, but like Latinos do, but we speak many different languages, and we're culturally, yeah, there are some things that unify us across culture, but I think we also have very distinct cultures too, depending on just which communities you're comparing within the AAPI umbrella. And so this makes it a lot more challenging for us to act collectively, right? Yeah, but all of that being said, I think that diversity is strength. You know, like, again, like in biology, where You know, genetically, the most robust organisms are the ones that are most genetically diverse.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same thing is true when you think about society as an organism. So when you think about the challenges that we face as AAPIs to organize ourselves and to be to capture more political power for our communities, not in a competitive way, but in kind of an empowering way, in a cooperative way with other communities, but to be heard, to be represented, right? I think that overcoming those challenges will make us stronger. It will make us very strong because there are so many challenges to overcome. So it's both a blessing and a curse.
So what do you think will motivate the Asian American community to show more support for kind of these causes or politically?
You know, I think I've kind of come to a place that not just for Asian Americans,
Sorry. Oh,
sorry,
you're back.
where did
You're
it cut
back.
off?
Oh, you left off as like one sentence in. Um,
So I think that yeah, what I was going to say is that not just for Asian Americans, but for human beings in general, I think that crisis is often required for change to happen. So that means that the moment that we're in right now, that is a very difficult one, also I think creates the opportunity for them to be very transformational change in our society. And that includes with Asian Americans who are affected in very particular ways with this pandemic. And also with all of the discussions that are emerging around race, right?
right.
That are very heavily, I think with good reason, focused around Black Americans. But I think that a lot of the conversations that are happening are more inclusive than just Black Americans, right? It's about a lot of different groups and about yeah, just anybody who's not non-white, basically, right, in this country. So I think it does take crisis often for us to change. The only exception to this, and this is why I ran for school board, this is why I maintain that, like, if I were to run for anything else, I think it would have to be something that has some influence over education, substantial influence over education. It's that the other thing is that you can change the way people are educated. And this is not in a like kind of a pedantic way. So again, kind of going back to the kind of advice that my parents gave me, right? It's not giving them a directive in the way that you educate them. It's not telling them what to think about the world, but how to think about the world, right? And how to interrogate the questions that they have, how to interpret the data that they collect. Like these kinds of things, it's like, you know, educating people in the manner of thinking, right? I think it's really critical. Whether we're talking about scientific literacy, which is relevant in this moment with a lot of misinformation and disinformation on the pandemic, or whether we're talking about civic literacy, I think that people need to learn how to think critically. And that I think may change. That may change for us a lot of the injustices that we see. It may resolve those injustices in very substantial ways when people realize that this is actually, like I told you, and I've come to believe, this is about manipulating ideas for power. And it's not because of the intrinsic inferiority of a particular group, right? It's not about the behavioral choices or the cultural practices of a particular group even. It's not. I mean, we're all different in different ways, right? And none of those ways is less or more than the others. Anybody who has those kinds of ideas, whether they believe it is by nature or by nurture, that any particular group is more or less than any other, that's a racist idea. And I think that there are ways to kind of unteach that. And it's not just in saying, don't be racist. Like, that does not work. I think it is in teaching people how to think critically about themselves and about the world around them. that I think will undo racism. And that is an educational endeavor that's long term. But I think that if people committed to those things, then, you know, both in leveraging the moment that we're in, right, to create some transformational change, and also committing to a longer term vision of educating people in such a way that they have the tools to interrogate this kind of manipulation that we're subject to, then I think we're going to solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, well, we've covered all of my questions, but do you have any closing remarks or any hopes for the future generations?
I mean, I just want to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys as part of this archival project. I had recently been asked by actually like 2 or 3 people. I think this week I'm knocking them all out
Wow.
to do these kinds of things, like podcasts or like
Yeah.
interviews. And I always feel very weird about that because I'm not somebody who tries to center myself in anything that I do. And I am very anti-cult of celebrity. I think that this also contributes to problems with civic consciousness, is that people externalize the responsibility to take action. They say, well, that person is amazing. That person is a hero. I'm going to clap for them and I don't have to do anything, right? And I think this is really problematic. And this is kind of, that was my first impression by like all of these requests to do these podcasts and this project. And is like, I don't like to contribute to that. But I will say selfishly that it actually does really help me to think about what I'm doing in my own life, to have the opportunity or the privilege to speak to you and to other people about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and how I think about the world. And so I feel in a selfish way very grateful for that opportunity for me. I'm hopeful that this is in some way helpful to other people. I don't know in what way precisely it will help other people, but I hope that it does. I imagine that you all think it will. That's why you've undertaken the task.
Yes.
And so are you back?
I am back. Sorry. Yep. Definitely froze for a while there. But yes. Yeah, no, I would just like to thank you for taking the time to do this interview and share with us your experiences. I don't know, I personally learned a lot in this hour and a half, and you were very well spoken. So, I mean, expected, but it's surprising nonetheless. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that it was helpful to you. I hope that it is helpful to others. And you're an undergrad at Rice, or you're a grad student?
Undergrad.
Undergrad. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good luck to you. I love Rice. My husband is a Rice grad.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I would have gone there, but I ended up going to Harvard. My parents were like, no, you need to go to Harvard. If you hate Harvard, you can come back to Rice. I did actually hate Harvard for the first semester, but they wouldn't let me come back to Rice. Anyway, I stayed there and it was fine. It was good.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I hated Rice for the first semester as well. So it might just be a first semester all around thing.
Yeah. It's just an adjustment for everyone.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, we will send you up a follow-up email with more details and anything else. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chelsea. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.